I went to war 4 times overseas, twice to Iraq, once to Afghanistan, and once to Bosnia. However, my most difficult war, the war that almost killed me, was my 5th, and that was the war at home. And had I not been able to bridge the gap between war and wellness, I'd just be another statistic, one of the 22 veterans that commit suicide every day. And this journey that brought me to the edge of self-destruction and then carried me over to the other side begins, and in some ways ends, with Freeman Gardner. In 2006, the organization that I led was in northern Iraq near the city of Mosul. And as crazy as this may sound, we were given the task to conduct a professional development class for a bunch of general officers while we were still fighting the war. And so to find the person that could give this class, and it was on a battlefield, a battle that was taking place near where we were located, between Alexander the Great and Darius III of Persia, that happened in 331 BC. We had to find somebody that could, 1, know something about the battle, 2, was capable of giving the brief, and 3, had the courage to give this presentation to a bunch of very, very senior officers. And so I sent out a request through my battalion of about 500 men and women, and one name came up. It was Freeman Gardner. Now, Freeman Gardner was very junior in rank, and so I had a little bit of reservations. Was he going to be the person that can conduct this class to standard? And when I met him, I knew he was the right guy. Freeman was a 27-year-old from Little Rock, Arkansas. He got married right before he deployed. Freeman was one of these guys that he had this, these soft eyes, these inviting eyes, and this permanent grin on his face. His friends used to make fun of him and say, even when Freeman would be mad, he'd still have that grin on his face. And so being around him, it's like he was a little Yoda, You felt wiser just being in his presence. So I knew Freeman was the person to give this class. And so on the day of the presentation, Freeman was on a plateau that overlooked this great battlefield. And the general officers were all surrounded by him. And Freeman was talking about how the outnumbered force of Alexander the Great defeated, the vast army of Darius III of Persia. And the generals were just wrapped, hanging on every word that he said. And he gave this, the class for about an hour or so, and he did it without note cards, and it was just amazing. So at the end, he asked if there were any, questions. And so the most senior officer, the most senior general, 4-star general, said, well, hey, specialist, where did you learn how to, all about this battlefield? And so Freeman pulled out of his, dusty cargo pocket of his ACUs, and he says, Plutarch's Life of Alexander the Great. He said, would you like to read it, General? And the general's like, he takes the book and he looks at it. He says, well, does it have any pictures in it? And then Freeman says, no, sir, but the words aren't too big, so you should be okay. I mean, whoa, we said, it was like, wow. And then the general laughed. And he took a commander's coin, which is a great award prize that commanders give to soldiers, and shook Freeman's hand and thanked him for the presentation and congratulated him on a job well done. And I'd never been more proud in my life. And so that was November of 2006. I wouldn't see Freeman again till 22nd of March 2007. We moved from northern Iraq in the town of Mosul down to Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, as a part of General Petraeus's surge to end sectarian violence in the capital. And we were getting ready to conduct a mission in central Baghdad to clear an area of improvised explosive devices, IEDs. The company commander that was in charge of that particular mission came to me and said, hey, sir, I need more time to plan. And I told him we really don't have any time. You're going to have to execute the mission. He pressed me and says, I don't really have the information and intelligence on the enemy that I really need. And I said, hey, you gotta roll, brother. Freeman Gardner was in that company. And roll they did. And they got to the location where they're going to clear the area of IEDs. And they didn't have enough people to pull security while they were doing the clearance. And so Freeman volunteered. It wasn't Freeman's job. He was a communications specialist, but he volunteered to get out of the vehicle and overwatch his comrades as they conducted clearance. And so as Freeman set up on the corner of a building to protect and secure his buddies, an IED went off and killed him instantly. We brought Freeman's body back to the Troop Medical Facility to prepare him to, for the return trip home to Little Rock and to his mother. And is the custom, all the leadership gathered around Freeman to say goodbye. And Freeman just had a wool blanket over his chest, and to cover up where he took most of the trauma. And other than a small cut above his eye, he looked peaceful, looked like he was asleep. And so we all said our prayers, for Freeman and his family. And I bent down to kiss Freeman's forehead, like I was kissing him goodnight. And as I came up and I looked, and I thought to myself, I caused this. If I'd only given the commander more time. And so Freeman departed, and I went back and I wrote a letter home to his mother, Miss Farrah Ratcliffe. And I sent the letter off and waited and got back to work. It came back about a month later. I got a letter back. And I looked at it on my desk, and I didn't want to pick it up to read it. I was afraid what it was going to say. But I did. I opened the letter and I read it. And in part it said, "Dear Lieutenant Colonel, your letter came to me at the right time. I was feeling very sad, and I was wondering what happened on that terrible day. Your words and description of the events made me feel better. Freeman Gardner was my #1 son. He lived to be the best. God bless you and those you command, and thank you for taking your time out of your busy day to write me this letter." I put the letter on my desk, and I went and I shut the door. I sat down, and I cried for a very, very long time. The shame that I felt was like a boulder on my chest. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it off. I carried that boulder back with me from Iraq to home. And then I carried it with me again to Afghanistan when I deployed a couple of years later. Even though during the war it was much lighter. It was almost like it wasn't there anymore while I was back at war. But when I came back home, it returned. And as I spent time home and trying to figure out what to do with this shame, I began to drink heavily, trying to get the courage, not the courage, but the strength to push this boulder off my chest. You see, Freeman was visiting me in my dreams nearly every night, along with some of the other images of war and the thoughts of my other dead friends. And I didn't realize the impact that it was having on my family. See, combat changes a person, and I had become more angry. And it got to the point that I had these outbursts, and the people around me, particularly the people that I loved, got numb to my outbursts. Then they got numb to me. And then I got numb to life. And I really didn't know this about myself until one night I was at home, and I had earlier that day called a commander of mine to see if I can get back to the war. I wanted to go back to Afghanistan, so I emailed, then I called him, and I told my wife. He said, "Hey, I'm looking to go back to Afghanistan." And by that time, she was very dismissive of me because I had become so abusive. But my daughter had heard what I was saying outside of our room, and she burst in. And she says, "You know what, Dad? Go ahead, go back to war. Me and Mom are better off without you. You have not been the same since you got back from Iraq, and it got worse since you got back from Afghanistan. I wish I could expunge your DNA from my body. I hate you." Well, I called I emailed my boss the next day and said, hey, I can't go to Afghanistan for personal reasons. And that would have been my 5th war. I didn't go. What I didn't know, though, is that I was already in that 5th war. And it came a time when I wanted to end it. On September 12, 2013, I was at a bar looking at the 2nd Street Bridge that connected Jeffersonville, Indiana, where I was drinking, with Louisville, Kentucky, where I lived. And I had a magnificent view of the skyline and the bridge. And I'd been drinking beer and bourbon pretty much throughout the afternoon and into the evening. And I finished my last drink. I paid my bar tab. And I went down to get in my vehicle with the intention of driving it into the Ohio River and killing myself. I know there may seem to be more efficient ways to commit suicide, but I was looking for ambiguity, not efficiency. See, I'd rather be remembered as a reckless drunk than another sick soldier. Fate had other plans for me, though. About a quarter of a mile down the road, I was arrested for DUI, stopped by a police officer, arrested for DUI, and put in jail. The next morning, when I got out of the drunk tank, I called my wife. And as I mentioned, my wife had long said that, that I had a challenge, that I had problems, and she had told me that, I needed to get help. My wife was a veteran. She's also a clinical psychologist who actually treats soldiers with PTSD. What does she know, right? Right? So I call her that morning, and before I could say a word, she says, either you go to therapy or you'll never see me or your daughter again. My wife laid the first brick in this bridge to wellness that day, because if she had not said what she did, I'm convinced that my second attempt at suicide would not have failed. If nothing else, she helped me realize that my family, at least, was worth living for. I went to therapy, but I had always been apprehensive about therapy. First of all, I didn't think I had a problem. You don't get sick serving your nation. And even if you did, it was part of the deal whenever you signed up. We're volunteers, not victims, after all. But what I realized in my initial phases of therapy is that warriors have a duty to get well. And we can't always do it ourselves. I had been diagnosed with PTSD. And, I had all the symptoms, restlessness, lack of sleep, reckless behavior, anger, paranoia, hypervigilance. There was no doubt that I had PTSD. However, in the interactions with my therapist, it became very clear that something else was working against me. And through our discussions, we came to the conclusion that the grief that I felt for my role in Freeman Gardner's death was a root cause of my problems. I had a moral injury, and I just couldn't shake the shame. So my therapist recommended that I try a program called prolonged exposure. And prolonged exposure requires that you retell and many times relive the events that caused the trauma. It was one of the most difficult things that I ever did in my life. But what it allowed me to do was to accept that sometimes bad things happen to good people like Freeman Gardner, and that I had to forgive myself. That was important, but here's the problem. How does the self-forgiveness come about? And that's the thing with moral injury, is how do you heal a broken spirit, a broken soul? If you haven't ever heard Dr. Brene Brown speak on vulnerability and shame, I recommend that you do, because it really helped me understand what I needed to do in order to heal the moral injury that I had. One of the first things she talks about in one of her TED Talks is the difference between guilt and shame. She says that guilt is that you made a mistake. Shame is that you are a mistake. Guilt, I have guilt over, when I was in the Army and I spoke harshly to a coworker or to an employee or someone that I worked with, I can go back and apologize. But shame, how do you apologize? How do you get, when, something that you did caused the death of another person, another human being? It's hard to get over. You see, that made me the mistake. But the thing about Dr. Brown is that she offers a solution. And she says that grace means that your mistakes now serve a purpose instead of serving shame. And that was something that I could work with, So when I got out of the Army and retired in 2014, I started volunteer work with an organization called Youth Build, and I helped mentor young kids. I started a group, co-founded a group where we use Shakespeare to work with veterans, arts and healing to help them deal with PTSD. I wrote a book about the challenges that I had, and I did public speaking in order to impart some of the lessons that I had learned, and I became an advocate for restorative justice and ending violence in a city. And I say this all not to brag, not at all. I say it because it helped save my life. It gave me a purpose. It gave me a new mission. And a part of that was my interaction and becoming immersed in my community with a group of compassionate people who cared about me and who had a conversation with me about the challenge that I was experiencing. See, the bridge that landed me safely on the shore of sanity was built by many hands. It certainly wasn't done by myself. By my therapist, my wife, my fellow veterans, the people in my community. They all came together, and what was interesting is that they never thanked me for my service. No, rather, they thanked me through their compassion and caring and willingness to have a conversation. A conversation like we're having right now, even though I'm doing most of the talking. This, I hope, would go out and spread, and the dialogue would continue outside of this auditorium. And I want to thank you for this, for that, because I know a lot of the things that I'm saying aren't very comfortable, but you're listening. And that's what America has to do. They have to have this conversation with veterans. And just think if that was the case, that a great, magnificent bridge was built across to every corner of our nation, and that the American people and that the veterans could walk hand in hand, meet in the middle of this bridge, walk hand in hand to the other side of the war and transition home together through this conversation about our experiences, so we can gain the empathy and gain the understanding of what it's like to be at war. I mean, this would have an enormous impact on our nation because the more you understand veterans, the American people understands the veterans and the veterans' experience, because there's only 1% of us that have served in combat or in the military, is that when our politicians call to put boots on the ground in some distant war, America will have the empathy and the understanding through this conversation with their veterans to raise their hands and say, not so quickly. There are souls in those boots. Souls like Freeman Gardner's that has passed on. Souls like mine that can be saved.